Welcome to my channel Brain Decoded. Today I'm going to show you how to turn off distractions and turn on true power. Welcome to the focus protocol. Picture this, you sit down to work, but within minutes your brain has ponged between a dozen notifications, half-finished tasks, and mental clutter. You feel tired, unproductive, even though you tried. That's not you failing, that's your brain being hijacked by distraction. Today we flip the script. We're going to create a protocol so you regain control, harness your focus, and unlock your power. Let's dive in. Distraction is not a lack of willpower, it's not a personality flaw, and it's not evidence that you're failing. What we call getting distracted is actually the brain doing exactly what it evolved to do: constantly scan for novelty, evaluate potential threats, and shift attention toward anything that might matter. When you understand that, you stop blaming yourself and start working with the machinery of your nervous system instead of fighting it. Your brain is wired with circuits that rapidly respond to new stimuli. A buzz, a notification, a thought, even a flicker of movement in your peripheral vision can trigger a shift in neural activity. These shifts happen far faster than conscious control. Long before you decide whether something deserves attention, your system has already flagged it as relevant. So the real issue isn't a shortage of discipline, it's the presence of highly efficient, deeply embedded mechanisms that prioritize interruption over sustained focus. Much of this happens in the interplay between prefrontal networks that support deliberate concentration and subcortical circuits that react to novelty. When you sit down to work, you're essentially asking these systems to engage in a quiet tug-of-war. The prefrontal cortex attempts to anchor you to the task, while other brain regions constantly sample the environment for the unexpected. The moment something feels more stimulating, your attention shifts. That shift isn't a failure, it's biology, but here's the empowering part. Just because distraction is wired into you doesn't mean you're doomed to be controlled by it. Focus emerges when you create conditions that reduce the brain's need to scan, filter, and evaluate competing stimuli. This is why even simple environmental changes can dramatically improve your ability to stay on task. When your phone is out of sight, for example, the brain gets fewer cues that trigger novelty-seeking circuits. When your workspace is structured and predictable, you reduce the cognitive load of managing chaos. These aren't hacks, they're ways of altering the inputs your attention system receives. Your internal state matters just as much. Fatigue, stress, and elevated emotional load all increase susceptibility to distraction. A tired or overstimulated brain is more reactive. It looks for relief, escape, or a quick dopamine hit. This is why people feel more distractible late at night or after prolonged effort. On the other hand, when your physiology is balanced, when breathing is steady, posture is aligned, and your system isn't flooded with stress signals, your attention becomes naturally more stable. You aren't forcing focus, you're enabling the neural conditions that support it. Distraction reduction, then, is less about pushing harder and more about engineering your internal and external environment. It's about understanding that attention is a limited resource, influenced by the cues around you and the state within you. When you cut down unnecessary stimuli, regulate your energy, and give your brain clear signals about what matters, you shift from reactive to intentional. You stop relying on raw willpower, which is fragile, and start leveraging biology, which is reliable. This is how sustained focus is built, not through force, but through alignment. Focus works in layers, broad to narrow. The brain doesn't jump straight into deep concentration the moment you decide to work on something. Instead, it cycles through a predictable sequence, first opening a wide attentional frame, then progressively narrowing down to the specific target. This layered progression is fundamental to how your nervous system organizes information, filters distractions, and decides what deserves your cognitive resources. The first layer is the broad sweep. When you begin a task, your attention system activates a generalized state of readiness. It's as if the brain asks, what category of things should I care about right now? This isn't yet about the fine details. It's about priming entire networks, visual, auditory, motor, memory, base, to orient toward a particular domain. For example, deciding you're going to write doesn't immediately lock your brain onto the exact sentence you want to produce. Instead, it activates a broader context, Language, structure, ideas, the tone you want, the purpose behind the task. This broad layer sets the stage. It tells your system what universe it's operating in. Once that general frame is established, the brain begins to narrow. This transition is driven by coordinated patterns of neural activity, especially in the prefrontal and parietal areas that control selective attention. It's like going from scanning an entire landscape to zooming in on a single point of interest. You begin filtering out irrelevant cues, not because you're exerting more effort, but because your brain has been cued to suppress what doesn't fit the chosen category. This narrowing is where many people stumble, because distractions often hijack the process before it's complete. If your environment is noisy, your phone is nearby, or internal stress signals are high, the brain never fully transitions into the narrow channel. You remain stuck in broad mode, where everything competes equally for your attention, but when the narrowing does occur, something powerful happens. The brain enters a state where fewer stimuli get access to conscious processing. Sensory noise is reduced, competing thoughts lose intensity, the circuits that support task-specific work strengthen their signal relative to everything else. This is why deep focus feels like tunnel vision. Your attentional aperture has become small, dense, and precise. At this stage, cognitive efficiency increases dramatically. You can retain information more easily, sustain effort longer, and detect smaller details because your neural networks are no longer splitting bandwidth across multiple possibilities. Importantly, this layered process can be trained and accelerated. When you consciously define your goal before starting, you're helping the broad layer form quickly. When you remove distractions and create a stable environment, you're making it easier for the brain to shift into the narrow layer. When you maintain a calm physiological state, you reduce the internal noise that otherwise interrupts the transition. Over time, this practice teaches your brain to move through the layers more efficiently, allowing you to drop into deep focus faster and with less resistance. So the real skill isn't forcing concentration, it's guiding the brain through its natural layers. Start broad, give your system clarity, then let it narrow. When you work with these layers instead of fighting them, focus feels less like a struggle and more like a natural progression toward mental precision. To turn on power, you must control your environment, because the brain is constantly negotiating with the sensory world around you. Every sound, every light change, every movement in your peripheral vision represents a potential demand on your attention. Your nervous system evolved to track these signals automatically, long before conscious focus existed. So when you sit down to work and you're surrounded by noise, notifications, clutter, or unpredictability, your brain is forced into a defensive stance, scanning, filtering, evaluating. In that state, deep focus is nearly impossible. The way to create real cognitive power is by designing an environment that quiets those competing inputs so your brain can direct its full resources where you want them. The first layer of environmental control is visual. The human visual system is the most energy-demanding sensory system, and it constantly pulls neural resources toward anything that moves or stands out. A messy desk, random objects in your field of view, or screens glowing in the background all increase the workload on your attention networks. When you streamline your workspace, remove unnecessary items, and position yourself toward a stable, non-distracting visual field, you reduce the number of signals your brain must suppress. This alone frees up cognitive capacity for sustained work. Sound plays an equally powerful role. Sudden noises activate circuits that orient your attention before you even register what happened. Even low-level background conversations can drain your attentional bandwidth because your brain is trying to parse meaning from them. Creating a quieter environment through closed doors, noise, canceling headphones, or consistent non-distracting background sound reduces the number of alerts your nervous system must track. When the auditory world becomes predictable, the brain relaxes into a more stable concentration state. The next layer is digital. Devices are engineered to trigger your novelty circuits. Every vibration, every badge icon, every pop-up is a micro-interruption that hijacks your neural rhythm. Even if you ignore it, your brain has already shifted attention. Keeping your phone out of reach and out of sight, closing unnecessary tabs, silencing notifications, and using full screen modes are not just productivity tricks. They are ways to prevent your attention architecture from being fragmented. When you limit digital intrusion, you give your prefrontal networks the conditions they need to sustain continuous, high-quality focus. Lighting, posture, and temperature also shape cognitive power. Bright overhead lights or flickering screens can stress the visual system. Poor posture sends signals of fatigue throughout the body. A room that's too warm makes the brain sluggish, while a cooler environment promotes alertness. Small adjustments in these factors can significantly improve your ability to sustain mental effort. Finally, predictability is key. The brain thrives in environments where it knows what to expect. When your workspace, tools, and timing are consistent, the nervous system reduces its vigilance. This decreased vigilance is not a loss of alertness. It's a reduction in noise. And in that quieter internal landscape, your focus naturally sharpens. You don't have to force power. The environment unlocks it for you. When you control your environment, you're not just optimizing a room, you're reshaping the neural inputs your brain must manage. You're removing friction, reducing noise, and giving your attention the space to fully engage. That's how you turn on power, by designing a world that supports, rather than competes with, your focus. Focus is trainable, and the brain makes that clear every time it adapts to repeated patterns of behavior. Attention isn't a fixed trait you either have or don't have. It's a dynamic skill shaped by the circuits you reinforce daily. When you repeatedly shift your attention, check your phone, multitask, or jump between ideas, you're training your neural networks to be scattered. When you repeatedly hold your mind on one task, redirect gently when it wanders, and create structured blocks of concentration, you're training the same networks to become stronger, faster, and more stable. The brain learns what you teach it. One of the most important mechanisms behind this trainability is neuroplasticity, the ability of neural circuits to strengthen or weaken based on use. Each time you engage in focused work, the networks in the prefrontal and parietal regions responsible for sustaining attention fire in coordinated patterns. Repetition stabilizes those patterns. Over time, the brain becomes more efficient at dropping into focus because the pathways associated with concentrating become more dominant. You're essentially building a neural shortcut that makes deep work easier to access. The opposite is also true. Frequent distraction teaches your brain that it should be ready to pivot at any moment. It reinforces short bursts of attention followed by quick shifts, creating a rhythm of fragmented engagement. The good news is that no matter how many years you've spent in that state, the system remains flexible. It can be retrained with consistent practice. A core part of that training involves deliberate redirection. When your mind drifts, as it inevitably will, the key is not to get frustrated or attempt to force attention, but to simply bring it back. That simple act of returning is the repetition that strengthens the focus circuit. You don't need to be perfect, you just need to be consistent. Each return is a rep for your attention system, just like lifting a weight strengthens muscle fibers. Predictable routines also play a significant role. When you create a ritual around starting focused work, clearing your space, setting a timer, taking a few controlled breaths, you're cueing your nervous system to shift into a state optimized for concentration. These cues eventually become strong enough that your brain recognizes them as a signal. Now we focus. Over time, this transition becomes faster and more reliable. Physiological state matters too. A calm, alert brain is far better at sustaining focus than one flooded with stress hormones. Practices that regulate your internal state, brief breathing exercises, exposure to natural light, movement breaks, support the neural machinery that underlies sustained attention. They don't produce focus by themselves, but they create the conditions in which focused work becomes easier. The more you intentionally practice focus, the more it becomes a trait rather than an effort. You start to notice that slipping into distraction feels wrong, like breaking form during a workout. You begin to crave the clarity that comes from deep work. This shift is the hallmark of a trained attention system. It reflects a brain that has been shaped through repeated, deliberate engagement. Focus, then, is not something you wait for. It's something you build rep by rep, day by day. As we wrap up, remember this: turning off distractions isn't about elimination only. It's about creating the right internal and external conditions so your brain chooses focus. And turning on power is about activating the neural hardware, the circuitry of attention, so that work, creativity, growth become not difficult but aligned. Today you learn the strategy, recognize the distraction, trigger the focus mode, build the infrastructure, deploy tactics, and stay consistent. If you commit to the focus protocol, the systematic approach will move from reactive drift to proactive power. Your environment will serve you, not sabotage you. Your brain will hone in, not wander. Your output will rise, not clutter. Thank you for joining me on Brain Decoded. If this resonated, hit subscribe, share with someone who needs focus, and in the next video we'll dive deeper into how to monitor your attention state in real time and how to build lasting neural habits of power and focus. Until then, turn off the noise, turn on your power and focus.